gentleman who hired me had decided that given what the State Department was paying, that he'd have to get really young folks. And so I, of course, was in my early 30s because it wasn't I mean, really, the pay wasn't competitive. But it was just an incredibly exciting time because he was a Jesuit priest. So that's important in terms of the careful, clear thinking he liked to do. And I learned a really important thing from him about you need to be tight conceptually before you ever move forward procedurally to do it. You can get kind of loose procedurally if you're really tight conceptually. And really, that first year we did something State Departments would never do now. We sat around and talked. That the year it was going to take, we were going to implement screening. And I remember having yelling, screaming fights with a good friend now who was the deaf consultant, because screening to her meant something very different than it did to me. Marion Frostig and Kephart trained about how we would, how screening would look in the state and how assessments would look. We literally developed the whole process. And so it was really fun. And I was at the State Department then for 19 years, responsible for learning disabilities and emotionally disturbed programs. Very rural state. And the big challenge, I asked about Frank Hewitt, because the big challenge was, how do you take something to scale? The law says do it. And, I mean, we are mostly a rural state with just along the Front Range. So how in the world, it's nice to use words like continuum of service. They didn't have enough kids to do continuum of service for the high incidence, you know, but for really emotionally disturbed kids, how were we going to take that to scale? And there really were like 5 or 6 behavior programs or emotionally disturbed programs that were very more clinical. Frank's wasn't, which is why it was always attractive to me. And not that clinical's bad, but you then can't export that out. So it became a major issues of doing that. And in Colorado, there's a strong strong, it's in the Colorado Constitution that matters of curriculum and instruction are left up to school districts. So always it had to be a conceptual model or direction and working in that. And
so very kind of bottom up rather than top down, but with the guidance.
Yeah,
from the
kind
top.
of, and frankly it met my own value system about going and teaching and talking and working with and so forth. But you can do whatever you want. Here's what we did in Colorado. You can do whatever you want for emotionally disturbed kids as long as, and we developed a model that had 6 components. That for every kid you can talk about the environmental management, behavior management, affective ed, counseling, academics, and vocational that you're doing. So we had 6, the bubbles.
So they had to address each
one of them, but it was still general direction, if you will, but a lot of training, a lot of so forth, and because I was also responsible for learning disabilities, it worked nicely given the rural nature that people just from the beginning assumed that, of course, they would need to be responsive to kids with both sets of problems. And since they look a lot alike as they get older and older, that wasn't too bad, right? Yeah, they could pass either way. That worked out fine. Then I left the department in '95 and went to Jefferson County School District, which was is the largest district in the state, the whole western side of the city, and was the executive director for pupil services there, and retired from there in 2003, and have been consulting on a various numbers of things now.
Ditto. No, I would agree, and I'd just add that you know, one of the issues that's interesting now is research, you know, the evidence-based practice research, and that's been a huge influence too. But you know, I wouldn't have given myself, you know, I wouldn't have put odds on myself being a person who kind of embraced psychopharmacology, because I was a card-carrying, you know, behaviorist in that. But you know, it's interesting that when you look at evidence-based practice, you go where the data leads you, and the data starts to lead you not only in some of the areas of behavioral, you know, improvements with medication compared to behavioral or cognitive behavioral treatments, but in the area of academic achievement. You know, there's a lot of outcome measures, academic achievement. We've never used academic achievement outcome measures in a lot of psychiatric research, let alone BD research, and we're starting to do that now in our BD research. But if you look at 2 things, I think, in that area, and just to elaborate on what Kay was saying, one of which is when you look at brain imaging and you can see the before and after pictures, when you do cognitive behavioral therapy, And it affects different areas of the
Yes.
brain when you do psychopharmacology. And that's why the combined treatments seem to work better. They give you a broader coverage.
Mhm.
And the other thing that's interesting is in evidence-based practice now. In medicine and in psychiatry, the area I know the most, and I kind of subscribe now still to about 4 child psychiatry journals, but you know, they look at, in their research outcome, they look at not whether this program did better than the control group, but they're now, the standard in evidence-based practice for them is, does this new medication or this new cognitive behavioral procedure do better than what our best practice is?
Oh, that's a great month.
And so, you know, they, in the MTA study, they took the best behavioral practice. I mean, we couldn't afford it. I mean, it's really quite well done. And they put that as the standard they had to beat with medication. And they did beat it. Now, the follow-up studies suggest that everybody's gone down and looks about the same at the end of the 3rd follow-up, which is 36 months out. But everybody's done about 1 to 1.5 standard deviations better. But the problem is, the people in the control group and the behavioral group basically are all on meds practically, and the people in the medication group, since they're no longer paid for it, and there are a lot of poor families in that group, can no longer afford the medication. And so everybody kind of looks the same, but they all look better. And it's primarily the medication that seems to have made the difference. But I think the behavioral made a huge difference too. But they're looking at, in outcomes, not only, you know, looking at comparison between what the best practice is, but they're looking at who gets cured. And by cured, you don't really cure an emotional behavioral disorder, but you control it so that on your rating scale, it's no longer in the clinical range. So all of the kids get into these programs, get in there based on a rating scale, which puts them well into the clinical range. And at the end of the time, they look at the kids who are responders, those who are no longer in the clinical range. Now, we've never done that. We've kind of looked at, you know, kids whose, you know, baseline is here, and with treatment it goes up here, and then they kind of do something like this, but we don't know if this is kind of normal or not. We don't know if this is adequate. And the same way with our randomized controlled trials, you know, one is better than the other. You know, this is significantly different than the control group or whatever. But if you start to look at the people who are no longer in the clinical range, that's a pretty heavy standard, you know, and everybody's using that as their standards now. I'm going to talk tomorrow with the administrators and talk to them about those 6 studies that are pretty representative of the ones that have been done, and looking at the clinical responders. And that gives you pause both in the area of behavior